Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we are extremely excited to welcome to the podcast today someone who I've admired for many years, and that is Andrew Preston. Andrew is the W.L. Lyons Brown Jr. Jefferson Scholars Foundation Distinguished Professor of Diplomacy and Statecraft at the University of Virginia. Andrew, I think you should ask for that title to be made a little bit longer. And he's also the author of Total Defense, The New Deal, and the Invention of National Security. And in no doubt, what is the highlight of his career, the editor at Cambridge University Press, who commissioned the Cold War Liberalism edited volume. So, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Danny. Hi, Derek. It's a real pleasure to join you guys.
Pleasure's all ours. Let's just dive into the book because this is really important, and I think it is funny, not funny, haha, or really funny at all, that we were talking about this, and because the Cold War liberalism volume, I think, really does relate directly to what you're doing here, which is trying to trace back what might be referred to as the United States' foreign policy regime or security regime to before the Cold War. That oftentimes people have identified the United States as what used to be called rise to globalism before that term sort of took on a odor in the last 10 years because of the election of Trump and its use amongst the alt-right and far-right in general, but basically tracing this to the New Deal period. So I think it might be worthwhile before we get into your argument about the book to sort of situate it and what intervention it is actually making in the historical literature. How have historians understood the United States' security foreign policy regime? And what is your book trying to do? And I think does quite well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And my sense of the reading in the historiography was that most historians of American foreign relations, until very recently, kind of assumed that national security as a way of identifying American self defense and identifying threats in the world um, was timeless. It went back to the founding of the nation, and that um, the way that Americans identify threats in the 20th century is pretty much the same as George Washington did it, or Thomas Jefferson, or Abraham Lincoln, or whoever. There's a smaller group of historians who have given national security a history, and that smaller group of historians, it's a very small group, but not a tiny group. Um, when they say that national security has a history, they pinpoint it to the early Cold War, and that makes sense because that's when the National Security Act was passed. That's when Truman starts talking about national security more than any other president had up to that point. It's when you start seeing the institutions of the national security state take real form. It's an era of paranoid, hysterical anti-communism, and not only abroad but also rooting out subversives at home. So there is this smaller group of historians who said national security is not timeless; it has a history of its own, and then they date its origin point to the early Cold War. And then if we think in terms of concentric circles and we go from the big circle, it's timeless, to the slightly smaller circle where no, it has a history and that its starting point is the early Cold War. There's a smaller circle within that that says, of a group of historians that you can probably count on one hand, who say it's not timeless. It does have its own history, but it doesn't begin in the early Cold War. It's a product of World War II or the World War II era. And they really look at the early 1940s, maybe the late 1930s. And I agree with that. That's kind of the literature that I'm adding to this small group of historians. But the twist that I put on it, and um, there aren't very many people who make the argument that I do. In fact, I don't think there's anyone who makes the argument exactly as I do. Um, I say it has a lot to do with world affairs and the world crisis in the late 30s and early 40s. It has a lot to do with domestic politics, and I build on that literature that makes that connection between domestic politics and foreign policy in a way that you have, Danny, in a lot of your writing. But I then make what I think is a novel argument by saying, actually, it's not just foreign policy, it's not just the world, and it's not just domestic politics, but it's about ideology, it's about liberalism, and that national security is, we should see national security very much as a part of the New Deal, and it's an outgrowth of New Deal liberalism.
Right, which is very much runs parallel to my claim that Cold War liberalism is very much the outgrowth of New Deal liberalism, and so that what's really I think we're both doing is basically tracing a transformation in American political thought that occurs in the wake of the multiple crises of the 30s, the Depression, the rise of Nazism, in particular, and also Soviet communism. But before we dive into that, I mean, what's great and what you do in a lot of your work is that you don't just start in the 30s or 40s, but you sort of place it in this deeper history in the United States. So let's talk about why those historians who think that national security is a timeless feature of American thought, what was actually the American conception of what would later be termed national security during the first century and a half of the existence of the Republic?
Yeah, so in the very first decades of the Republic, um, it's the only other time in American history until the 20th century when leaders did use the phrase national security. So Washington, Jefferson, Adams, they did say national security. They didn't say it often, but they did say it. But they meant the defense of territorial sovereignty. And there's, an obvious reason why they thought in those terms. It's because this new nation was weak, it was fragile, it was fractious. They were arguing with each other, and they were surrounded by enemies. Um, and so self-defense meant the defense of territorial sovereignty. And then that language of national security, that phrase national security, which just meant that, it meant protecting the physical sovereignty of the United States. That fades after the War of 1812. And after that, the language of defense is defense. It's about self-defense, and it's not used a whole lot because Americans don't have a whole lot to fear in the world. And I argue in the book that, well, it's I don't come up with the term, but I think I give it a new development. I use a term that political scientists have used called free security, and I argue that after the War of 1812, the United States could take its basic security for granted. It could assume that it would not be physically attacked, invaded, occupied, its government overthrown, its way of life changed by an external power. That just wasn't going to happen. So it could take for granted that it would be safe. It did not make the North American continent peaceful because American free security, ironically, then it removed threats from the United States. It opened up all sorts of possibilities for the United States, and then it made the U.S. in the 19th century a pretty aggressive power. I mean, if you ask, did the Canadians or the Mexicans or anyone in the Caribbean or Central America have free security? The answer is obviously no. And the reason they didn't was because the US was so powerful. Well, one of the reasons the US is so powerful is because it has no peer competitors in its neighborhood. So I trace that idea and I link it to developments in American political economy and state building um, and the fiscal military state through the 19th century into the 20th, when free security begins to disappear. And there's no exact pinpoint when it disappears, but it's sometime. Historians agree that it's sometime in the 1940s. I would say conceptually, Americans think they don't have free security until Pearl Harbor in 1941. Um, and then they really don't have free security when the Soviets test their atomic bomb in 1949.
So, how does the Civil War play into this? And then how does the Spanish American War play into this? And how do you interpret the Spanish American War? Because it's been interpreted in various ways. Either this is sort of the exception to the rule that the United States is not going to have a territorial empire akin to the British and the French. It's going to have a different type of empire for those who accept the imperial framing. Earlier in the 20th century, historians would argue just this shows the US isn't an empire, which I think no one essentially in our field agrees with any longer.
Right.
But how do you interpret the Spanish American War? And also, how does the Civil War, which I think historians have shown really make the nation focus on things like death, does it ironically not make the nation focus on quote unquote security? That is sort of the completion of the project of union, or how do you interpret that?
Yeah, so the Civil War, it is in my book. It's not a foreign war, obviously, but it is an important moment in my book. Um, the greatest threat to American security, the exception to free security, is not from without, but from within. And to me, that just accentuates the really unique character or the unique condition of free security that the U.S. enjoyed through the 19th century. Um, the U.S. then, I mean, the Civil War is kind of the ultimate example of something that I trace in the book, and that's what the Secretary of War, John Calhoun, who was had a lot of objectionable views on a lot of things, but was Secretary of War in the 1820s and described the American fiscal military state in a way that I think is extremely accurate. and he said that the United States should have an expansible army. And I like to think of it as a kind of accordion fiscal military state where you have a very small military, and then when you need it, you can expand it quite rapidly, and then you shrink it again right after the war. And that's what happened all through the 19th century. The US wanted to go to war. It had a very small standing military, but it's able to expand it almost at will in order to take on the British, the Mexicans, the South, or the North from the Confederates' point of view, and later on against the Spanish in 1898. Um, and there's a lot of debt financing for that. Um, but as soon as the war is over, there's this extremely rapid demobilization. I mean, it's as rapid as the mobilization. And that's why it's like an accordion. It expands, it contracts, it expands, it contracts very, very quickly. And the ultimate example of that is the Civil War. And I argue in the book that only, or I point out in the book, I'm not sure it's an argument, but I point out that only a state that could feel secure in itself and in its position in the world could afford to have such a small military through the 19th century. Because if you compare, I mean, even if you compare it to some private European armies like the East India Company's army, which was not a part of the British state, so forget just the massive British military, even the East India Company had a much larger army than the US, except during the Civil War. So I do, and then coming out of the Civil War, Civil War
Wait, Andrew,
unites the country.
let me just
Yeah,
come in
go
very
for it.
quickly because I do
Go
have a
for it.
question.
Sorry.
So is that ideological? Is that there's an ideological commitment, based on almost a Hamiltonian perspective on the dangers of land armies, that you'll become a Sparta? Because I think, like, in a book that centers ideology, it's important to explain the causal mechanism. So why do you think that is? So there's the material reality of lack of competitors, but one can imagine a world where that could just be what happens after 1945. I would argue there was also a lack of competitors, but they claim that there isn't. So what allows the space for there not to be this large army?
So part of it is exactly that. There's an aversion, smaller Republican aversion to standing armies because it's considered a threat to democracy. There's definitely that. And I think expansionism is an ideology. And most of, except in a time of war, but also during a time of war, like in 1846, 47, 48, um, the military, the Navy and the Army are used to facilitate territorial expansion. And that's not just simply filing into empty space. That is an ideology in and of itself, part of manifest destiny, part of progress, and that all that sort of thing. Um, very quickly, in terms of the Spanish-American War, it's a great question. Um, what struck me in looking at the Spanish-American War and most American wars until World War II is that it was not justified in the name of self-defense. And so there's none of the language of national security that's become ubiquitous since World War II, where the president doesn't, today it's President Trump, but it could be any president, and it has been any president, who uses national security to justify all sorts of things, including invasion, but also all sorts of other things like tariffs or immigration controls. That language of self-defense, of national security, was not used. McKinley didn't use it to go to war with Spain and Cuba or the Philippines. Woodrow Wilson didn't use it in World War One, and I found that very interesting, and that helped me track maybe with a bit more precision the character of national security through time.
So what is the language that McKinley uses, and what is the language that Woodrow Wilson uses? I mean, my guess on Wilson is the language of making the world safe for democracy, which is a type of capital P progressive universalistic project. My guess is McKinley is going to talk in the language of interest and empire. But tell me, what do they talk about?
Well, McKinley doesn't talk about empire because he doesn't want to say this is a war for empire, even though it clearly is a war for empire. He uses the language of humanitarianism. The Cubans are being suppressed. They're being tortured. The Spanish are brutal. They're like the conquistadors of old. There's all this language about the sort of bloodthirsty Spaniards, and we have to come to the rescue of of the Cubans. McKinley does not talk about self determination or independence. So Cuba Libre is the rallying cry of the Cubans at the time. McKinley explicitly does not use that language because he doesn't believe in an independent, fully independent Cuba. He believes, as you said, he believes in empire. Wilson uses, the language of the world needs to be made safe for democracy. He uses that passive voice, um, and the terms are very universalistic. They're not nationalistic. He doesn't invoke self-defense. He says we need to make the world a better place. Now, you could make an argument. I think it's a true argument that in order, by spreading democracy, Wilson is making the world safer for the United States by spreading free trade, by spreading capital, by spreading a world of openness, at least openness in that kind of capitalist mindset. He's making the world safe for the biggest liberal democratic capitalist power in the world, and that's the United States. So there is self-interest. Wilson isn't just saying that just to be a nice guy, but that self-interest is not about protecting the USA.
And what about the American public during this period? I mean, this is the moment, probably the last moment between the 1880s and the type of peace progressives in the 1920s, where there's a broad-based anti-imperialist movement that's oftentimes connected to labor, and other ethno-nationalist groups as well. There's a deep racist undercurrent to a lot of these movements. But what is the American public, broadly speaking? What should we know about how they're thinking about security in this, progressive era moment?
Yeah, so the thing is, I think, especially the more time goes on, the American public is becoming more and more averse to war. The American public was very opposed to going to war from 1914 until 1917. And then I think if Wilson didn't want to go to war in 1917, he probably could have got away with it politically. Um, but Wilson and especially a lot of people around him want to go to war. The American people do not want to go to war in late 1939. And that's the big problem. We can talk about that in more detail. And that's the crux of the book is that that's FDR's key problem is that he does want to get the US more involved in the world crisis against Germany, against Japan. But public opinion is absolutely not with it. Even people who, you know, yes, you have the kind of racist, anti-Semitic corners in the eras of both world wars, but actually the real problem for FDR and for Wilson, but especially for FDR, is that you can't portray most of the people who don't want to go to war as anti-Semites or racists or head in the sand isolationists. They're internationalists. They just don't want to go to war, and that's that. There's a big difference there, and so leaders, not so much Wilson, and I think this is what FDR learns from Wilson, is that FDR then really amps up the threat in a way that is not realistic. And so he uses the language of self defense, but he turns to this new phrase, national security, that presidents before him had never used like he's using it and hadn't used it at all since the late 18th, very early 19th century. So he conjures up threat in a way that Wilson, McKinley, and other presidents hadn't before him.
How else is World War One a turning point? Let's talk about that teens and 20s period, because I think personally that is really where we see foreshadowings of what is going to be institutionalized later, both in the Roosevelt administration and after. You get the Espionage Act, you get the Sedition Act, you get the First Amendment cases that are ever heard by the Supreme Court in 1919 over free speech. You get the increasing centralization of power in the executive. You get the quieting down of political radicalism by the government. You get the formation soon thereafter of the modern FBI. So it's really that crucial moment. What happens during the Great War in the 20s and type of the lead up to Roosevelt and the New Deal?
Yeah, so all that's true, and I explore that in the book. I do say though that I have two chapters on the World War One era. I do characterize it as a kind of false start when we think about the trajectory of national security. So a lot of the building blocks are put into place for the national security state, including institutionally, and you said them all in terms of legislation, in terms of executive agencies and departments, in terms of law enforcement. Um, but it doesn't stick. And it doesn't stick even if some of those institutions like the FBI, even if they stick, even if the Espionage Act sticks, they don't cohere into something that we'd later call the national security state because Wilson hadn't made the case for war based on threat and self-defense or national security. And because after the war, because he hadn't done that, after the war, there is no threat. So Germany's defeated. Russia's been convulsed by revolution and is now, the Soviet Union, but is weak and is rebuilding. Britain is strong, but it's an ally. France is fairly strong. It's also an ally. The US absolutely doesn't feel any threat. So if you're to ask the American people, we need to have this permanent warfare state to have what George Kennan later calls all measures short of war. That's a hard case to make, and Wilson can't make it. That's why the Senate can reject the Treaty of Versailles without any consequences. So Wilson makes a lot of these gestures and puts in place, it's more than gestures, he puts in place, and Congress puts in place a lot of what you just said. And that fiscal military state, that accordion just really stretches very far in terms of building up a massive army, but it demobilizes right away. and that national security state does not crystallize. And that's one of the lessons that FDR learns from Wilson.
I want to sit on this for a moment because an argument that you'll often see made on the left is the importance of defense contracting. And in the 1920s is when you really do see, to my mind, the modern military industrial complex begin to form, particularly in the aviation industry, because that is just going to require an enormous amount of capital, of research and development, which private companies are going to have to do because the government, like you said, is ideologically committed to not doing it. But is the argument is ideology really central here? Or what else is happening with material and international capitalism and the formation of this early military industrial complex, particularly the what at the time I believe is the Air Corps? How come that doesn't push in a more militarizing direction, we might say? Why is the 20s and the Republican moment of the 1920s one in which there is this contraction? Because that leads to counterfactuals. That mean no Hitler, no American global domination, which we'll talk about later. But what is really going on in the 20s?
And it's a great question. You absolutely have those developments that you're talking about, especially as you said in military and civilian aviation. Um, but for the reasons that I said, it's kind of a false start. It doesn't cohere into a cohesive national security state based on a permanent sense of threat. And I think that's key. It sounds like a small distinction, but I think it's an important one. So you still have the technological advances in the interwar period. You still have the development of aviation. You don't have a very big military though. The U.S. has a very small military, even on the eve, even when Asia goes to war in 1937 and Europe goes to war in 39. The U.S. is not a major military power, and it wouldn't be until rearmament is embraced in 1940, and then it becomes this, as you're foreshadowing, this this leviathan in terms of military power from World War II into the Cold War. Um, the memory of World War One was extremely unpopular in the 20s and 30s, especially as we get in the 30s. And so you have, not just the rise of something like a military industrial complex, but you have the rise of fierce resistance on both the left and the right to the military industrial complex. So you have people warning about the merchants of death. That's the title of a 1934 book about munitions makers who kind of ginned up the case for war and kind of pushed America to war in 1917. You have the Nye Committee under Gerald Nye, who's not a progressive, um, saying essentially we went to World War One to line the pockets of rich people in Wall Street and in American corporations. Um, and so that memory of World War One has a serious dampening effect on what would later be like like the kind of thing that Eisenhower talked about in '61, like a serious, really embedded military industrial complex, or what we now call the national security state.
All right, let's get to the heart of the book, which is Roosevelt, and let's take a step back. Where does this guy come from, and why is it Roosevelt who introduces the concept of national security? Who is he ideologically? In the literature, he's not really considered much of a thinker. I think he's often, actually viewed as the classic liberal, not deep in ideology, but responding to various problem situations. But who was he and what is the New Deal? And let's really sit on how you think the New Deal sets the stage for what is coming later.
Yeah, thanks for that, Danny, because you've set it up nicely, and it is the crux of the book. So FDR is a patrician. He's as close to like an official aristocrat, like a British style aristocrat, as you'll find in the United States. He's essentially what if he was European, you'd call him landed gentry or idle rich or something like that. He's supremely well connected. He lives in the Hudson Valley, but he has connections to Washington and New York and elsewhere. He's instinctively, but not, I would say, not ideologically an internationalist, as in he's very wealthy. He travels the world. He feels at home in the world. He feels like the United States is a very special place, but a part, very much also a part of the world. And he's got political ambitions. He is a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, so he's a navalist like Teddy Roosevelt was. He believes in American power. He'd been Woodrow Wilson's assistant secretary of the Navy during World War One, a position that his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt had held during the Spanish-American War. And it's in that position that FDR really, he's a thorn in the side. He almost gets fired. He's a thorn in the side of higher ups and include in the administration, including President Wilson, in advocating for preparedness well before Wilson's ready for it. So he believes in a big military. He believes in a strong military state. Then he gets polio as an adult, and he's paralyzed, and he goes into politics. And I think it's his paralysis and then the condition of the country after 1929 that stirs something within him that had always been there. That is this sense of noblesse oblige, or it's a kind of progressivism. I think it's a very deeply felt progressivism. Um, to to help people not just to stave off revolution, although I think like all capital P progressives, that's a big that's something that he very much wants to stave off. But he also genuinely wants to help people and help the country. And by the time he becomes president and he wins the 32 election and becomes president in 33, um, I think he's worried about the collapse of American democracy. He's worried about the collapse of American capitalism, and he wants to save American society. And his solution to do so is this series of programs, or this one overall program with many, many, many different aspects to it that he calls the New Deal.
Can Andrew, maybe can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the outgrowth of this concept of national security as we think of it as a military thing from the fundamental kind of New Deal conception of security, which includes a lot of other things, economic security for, it's sort of inherent to the ideology underpinning the New Deal, but it means so much more in that context that we've come to, sort of allow it to mean since then.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When FDR becomes president in 33, at the very, very, in the very depths of the Depression, he constantly talks about security. It's my duty to provide security for the American people. And he uses that word security. Historians um, of the New Deal have pointed this out before I did. There's this massive and very rich literature on the New Deal. Jennifer Klein and David Kennedy. Historians have pointed out that he used the word security and the ideas of security more than he did words like liberty or democracy or capitalism. So he believed in security. That was the government's obligation. That's new in American political culture. That's a new social contract that FDR is coming up with, and he's changing the character of liberalism when he does that. Liberalism in the 19th century had meant individualism. I mean, liberalism always means at its heart the protection of the individual. And in the 19th century, the state was considered the greatest threat to individual liberty. So, therefore, liberalism is anti statist. And FDR then turns that on its head, and he says, actually, the greatest threat to liberty, to individual liberty, is economics, and especially private corporations and private capital. So the only entity that can protect individual liberty or safeguard individual liberty under those new conditions, because of the American industrial boom in the previous 40 years, it's only the government that has the strength to stand up for individuals. That's the new social contract. So he says, we will protect your security. We will enhance your security. We will provide you with security, 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 security. And that's in the first administration. Then by the time we get to, and he and Congress institute all sorts of things that facilitate this goal, most notably the Social Security Act in 1935. Then by the time he's reelected in 36, the Depression, it's not over. It's definitely not over. And there'd be a serious downturn in 37. But the worst seems to be over. It seems like America's found its footing again, and things are on the right track, at least economically. But at the same time, right at that moment, the world crisis starts to escalate. And FDR, then, the argument I make in the book is that he takes this language of security and he takes it from, New Deal government intervention and this new social contract of this new definition of liberalism. He takes it from the domestic realm and applies it to foreign policy. And he says, we will provide you with security against remote and distant threats. I have been doing that to provide you with security against unemployment and old age. Now I'm going to apply it to Germany and Japan. And
Wait,
so in the
Andrew,
book,
can I just jump in very quickly?
Yeah.
Because I think I don't think there's an American liberalism really until the 30s. I think that whatever you could point to in the United States is proto-liberal. I really do agree with Bruce Kuklick here that the United States really has a different matrix than Europe, where liberalism is a more enacted ideology connected to given political parties like the Liberal Party in the UK and various German parties in Weimar. I think FDR is creating an American liberalism. And Kevin Schultz, I'm sure you saw the book. FDR uses the term really for the first time in the 30s, 32 during the campaign because he didn't want to use socialist because there was still Wilson
Right.
sent troops to the Soviet Union. There was the first Red Scare, very anti-communist, anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the 1920s. So I would even go further. I would say that liberalism in the American context, not in the global one, but in the American context, liberalism and security are forged at the beginning here. And that this is why one thing that's coming apart today is that this sort of ideological structure that FDR created in the 30s no longer has hegemonic legitimacy in the Gramscian sense. So could we talk a little bit about like what is he doing to liberalism and where do you see liberalism coming from? Because to me, this is like an outgrowth, to borrow Gary Gersel, left wing progressivism that is now reformed in the 30s and
Right.
which will be
Right.
known by us in our lifetimes as American liberalism, but which there's no real American liberal in 1910. Lincoln is not a liberal. That doesn't make sense in 1860s America, even though if he shares certain things with Gladstone. I think you know what I'm saying, but I'd love to get
I
your take
do.
on
I
this
do.
as a history of liberalism. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Danny, and you're right. That's a really good intervention. It doesn't change the argument that I make in the book, and I think that's you would also
Not at all.
you would
Not at
agree
all.
with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so the kind of genealogy of liberalism that I trace in the book is not, or I don't really trace the genealogy of liberalism in the book. That's not the point of the book. It is about this new social contract, which I think is a new social contract in the American context that um,
And that social
FDR
contract
launches.
is identical with liberalism. I think
Yeah,
that's my point.
exactly.
Liberalism is that social contract in the America. It's not really about individualism. It's about this social contract that is now
Yeah,
coming apart. Sorry,
I think
please.
individual liberty might be different than individualism, though. I do think that FDR has at heart the freedom of the individual, the liberty of the individual, and it's not necessarily like a kind of individualism that you might associate with the Republican presidents of the 1920s or Reagan and so on and so forth. The other thing I would add to that is that what FDR does is he extends that in a way that Wilson tried and couldn't, as you were saying, as I was saying, um, to foreign and military affairs, and he really makes it stick. And that notion of liberalism that's based on security, that government provides for the people, then has this kind of, I call it a dyad, which is not a very good term, but I couldn't think of something else. But it's that very tight relationship between domestic security that's socioeconomic and military security that's external, or about foreign policy. And in the book, I end up arguing that not only is but social security, and thinking about social security and domestic security, that's the point from which he starts. And national security, and so national security isn't just the other side of the coin of social security. Thinking about national security actually has its origins in social security.
I have a question, a counterfactual. Why doesn't he create the NSC, CIA, DOD in the late 1930s? Why is that a product of the late 1940s? Because he creates the welfare state in the first term. Why not create the warfare state? Why leave that to Truman after? It's a counterfactual, but it's something that as I learn more about this period, I'm like, why didn't he do that? Because I
Yeah.
think you probably agree with me. I refer to it in the Cold War liberalism book, the second New Deal. Obviously, there's a phrase for it in the literature, and New Deal historians don't like this, but the second New Deal is the warfare state in the late 1940s, and that's really the end of the New Deal, which is over by McCarthyism. But why doesn't he do the institutional thing in the late 30s, in your opinion?
Well, he does do some of it. He doesn't do what Truman does in 1947 onwards. If you go from 47 in the National Security Act to 52 in the National Security Agency, there's a lot of institution building there, and a lot of the things that you just mentioned. But from 1940, 41 into 42, and I list them in the book, I have another kind of alphabet agencies of World War II, um, security state, part of the security state apparatus, um, that FDR puts in place in order to wage World War II. It's not as all encompassing as what comes in the Cold War that Truman does, and I think there are
But it's the
historical
but
reasons
it's
for
the
that.
war. but it's the war. So that's what I'm. So then is there like there's still an inability to do it in peacetime? Is that the big difference here? That he needs the emergency of war, even though before the United States formally enters it, the war has broken out. There's lend lease, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that I mean, as a distinction between Roosevelt and Truman, yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's excellent. I do say, that things like, Japanese internment, uh, which have an institutional apparatus, are also liberal projects, right? If you're going to have this kind of serious repressive state and to do something like that, we're gonna do so in order to set up schools in these internment camps and to teach people to read and write. And it's given this kind of New Deal flavor, and it's given the acronym as well. So there is this, across all sorts of aspects of the warfare state in World War II. But the warfare state that FDR sets up, I think he's not setting it up with a permanent, like what they do in 1947, what Truman does. It's supposed to be permanent. It's there without a kind of expiry date. Whereas much of what FDR does, is, including in the realm of national security, is as a wartime emergency, and I don't think he sees it as outlasting the war.
So, Andrew, before we move on to World War II, I do want to ask a question, which to me embodies the fundamental tension of the Roosevelt administration is that the man who did the most to institutionalize liberalism is also perhaps the president who set the stage for the illiberalism that I would argue defined much of post World War II American history. So, in addition to the WPA, the CCC, and the various social democratic elements of the Roosevelt administration, he also tries to pass the National Recovery Administration in clear violation of the Constitution. Probably the biggest example is the 3,700 executive orders, which are more than any other president before or since. You have the Supreme Court packing scheme of the later 1930s, but he is genuinely, someone who institutionalized liberalism. So, does this just mean that liberalism and illiberalism always went together in the American context and there's a dialectical relationship there? I'm just curious how you think about this problem, this tension, really, which to me is the defining ideological and institutional tension of the FDR administration. What do you think of it?
Yeah, it's a really tough knot to untie, and a lot of historians, better than I, have tried to untie it. I think you kind of hinted at the answer there. I think that if you're going to base your politics, and especially this new social contract, on the government's obligation to the people, and that our obligation is not to provide liberty, but it's to and not necessarily to provide justice. Although I think FDR would say he tried to do both, but it's to provide security. Then the temptation then to use all the means at your disposal is going to be enormous. That doesn't mean the liberals alone are going to be illiberal. Lots of people in American society and other societies, liberal societies, have been illiberal. But I think just the means of just being able to do so are there. And there's a really really rich literature now. Anthony Gregory, Beverly Gage, and other people who have looked at how the New Deal was also not just a war on poverty, but also a war on crime. There's a really good literature on Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, looking at basically the exact same thing. So there is a tendency there. I don't think it's inevitable, but there is a tendency.
So, was there a world where security doesn't become the defining logic? Or, I mean, this is the other counterfactual question, or is that what you needed in the United States? Is there a world where it could have just been a more humanistic, we're all here to help each other out, which the New Deal did have elements of that. I mean, that's one of the great things that the New Deal does do, but I do think it creates a security regime. I think your book is persuasive on that. So, is there a counterfactual world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Does that person who runs in 32 on on a kind of New Deal vision that is not based on security, does that person win the White House? Probably, given the conditions. Um, but that's kind of the promise that FDR was making, and that's what appealed so much to the American people. I think it's not really, the alternative isn't really, further to the left. The alternative would have been what we had in the 20s and what Herbert Hoover was offering in 1932. Hoover is, I don't think it's a coincidence that he is a fierce critic of the New Deal, and he's also a fierce critic of intervention later on. And so he's very anti-statist. He wants I mean, he's not as anti-statist as a lot of other people were. So the alternative, I think, is what Americans had been living with in the 1920s. And I think the counterfactual then is, if there hadn't been a depression, would something like that kind of security mentality have emerged? And I would say probably not.
So, how do Americans redefine their understanding of what national security is away from the physical protection of the republic to something else. Wertheim wrote about this, especially in his book Tomorrow the World, and he links it to a CFR planners who then come to shape the State Department, and it numerous different issues, essentially related to ideological ones about moving history in a particular progressive and liberal direction, and also maintaining the material capacity to challenge Nazi Germany, or if I recall correctly, the two major explanations that he gives. But
Right.
how does this happen in the 1930s? How do we go from physical security to something much, much broader that is going to then shape the World War II and post Cold War worlds?
Yeah, FDR is saying that American self-defense is not just about making sure that nobody storms the beaches of California or New York or Florida, but it's about protecting against remote and distant threats, later what we'd call the domino theory. It's also about protecting an American way of life. Because if that way of life is threatened elsewhere, then it's going to eventually, inevitably harm the United States. He warns in 1940 that he kind of scolds Americans and tells them we can't remain a lone island of democracy in a world ruled by force, which is revolutionary because if you think about it, Americans up to that point had reveled in being the lone island of democracy. That's the
The
whole
city on a
idea.
hill. Yeah.
Right, the city on a hill, the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, that doctrine of separation was it made Americans feel safe. Now he's saying actually separation is not safety. Separation is uh, is um, is fundamentally it's dangerous. And the argument I make in the book is it's ideological. It's about foreign policy, but it really is also about domestic politics. And I hinted at it before. FDR's problem is that he said that Germany and Japan are not just terrible, but they're dangerous. And then he had people like Herbert Hoover running around the country saying, yes, Nazi Germany is a terrible, they're awful. And this is why Hoover is so important, more important, I think, than Lindbergh or Nye or some of the others who you could say are anti Semites. There's no way you can say that Herbert Hoover was an anti Semite. And he's running around the country saying, yeah, I don't like Nazi Germany. I don't like Imperial Japan, but they're not going to hurt us. They're not going to harm us. And what Roosevelt is asking us to do is to commit to intervention that is against the spirit of American democracy. We tried that in World War I, and it was a mistake. Almost all American, well, not almost all, but a lot of Americans agreed with Hoover, definitely majority. Let's not get involved in that kind of overseas crusade again. That's their fight, not ours. And whenever FDR would say, "Well, we need to save the American way of life," and by intervening, Hoover would say, "No, the only thing we're going to do by intervening is endangering the American way of life because we will centralize power, war powers in the executive to an extent that we just won't be able to undo." And so what that does is it forces, and Hoover wasn't, I use Hoover a lot in the book because he's a good sort of catch-all for a large group of people. What that forces FDR to do is what John, my former colleague when I used to teach at Cambridge University, John Thompson, who wrote a fantastic book called The Sense of Power on a lot of these issues. It's what John Thompson said FDR had to exaggerate American vulnerability. And in order to convince Americans, they had to get involved in the war. And it's that process of exaggerating vulnerability, I argue, that creates the idea of national security that is about protecting not just physical territorial sovereignty, but against all sorts of threats all around the world.
Which, I mean, to my mind, I'm a fan of FDR in general, but that betrays the classic liberal fear of mass
Right.
politics, right?
Absolutely.
That is not a attempt at rational persuasion. It's lying, essentially. And even though if one might agree, as I do, that you needed to defeat Nazi Germany, certainly, it is something that is embedded in sort of this liberal hegemony that becomes dominant from the 30s forward.
But here's the thing,
So
Danny, can I
go,
just interject there? Here's the
please,
thing.
please, please.
I don't think he was lying. And this it depends on how you define lying. But I think he meant it. I think he was sincere and I think he thought it was real. And there's a a big part of me that agrees with him that yes, these are new dangers in a new type of world that have to be thought of in a new way. I'm not sure national security was the answer, but then again, it was a pretty difficult situation where you're making stuff up on the fly. And if that's what he makes up, it makes sense in the context of the late 30s, early 40s. It does lead to a number of abuses during the war. And then, of course, it creates this national security state afterwards that has that sort of, has so many abuses and gets America involved in lots of wars it doesn't need to do. But I think FDR I don't think it's a matter of lying. I think he thought he was being honest, honestly.
I think he blur. I agree. I think most people who say things believe what they're saying.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't agree with historians who argue that it's sort of a smokescreen. I think it's a blurring of capacities and intentions. And I think that becomes one of the major features of American foreign policy discourse, and you see it even with the way people talk about Iran. Iran could get 1,000 drones in the next month and thereby threaten the United States. It could do X or Y. And so what it winds up doing is it's creating a culture of international relations, thinking that essentially, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, says the only way the United States could be safe is if it engages in world domination. And so maybe you could um, it was more genuine vis-a-vis Nazi Germany, although from a particular perspective, I don't think Hitler was going to ever invade the Western Hemisphere. I think Hitler,
Yeah,
much like Stalin after the war, thought that the United States would give him Europe and they would have their hemisphere, which is what they've always done. So I am sympathetic to FDR. I do think you need to defeat Nazi Germany. I just wish it wasn't through this argumentative strategy because I think it had such pernicious effects in retrospect. He couldn't have known that. But I think it's one of the major reasons that the American foreign policy thinking has been so frankly foolish for so very long. And it really does start here. But I mean, a historical actor, can never know how they're going to be thinking. And I mean, I agree with Andrew Stevenson. He did view the Nazis as a gangster state that you couldn't deal with. He uses that all the time, and he's not wrong about that.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, it's just the complexities here.
yeah. Agreed. I mean, I don't think I could add anything to that.
So let's talk about
It's
World
great.
War. Yeah. So let's talk about World War II, and how the war itself is really what institutionalizes this. And then to me, it also raises the question: is you're right? I agree. You didn't think the OSS and OWI were necessarily going to be permanent features, that the Joint Chiefs were going to be permanent features. But what did he think he was doing? I mean, this is the question. The big counterfactual of basically the last 100 years is, I think if FDR lives, I don't think there's a Cold War. I'm extreme on that position. I think him and Stalin reach an agreement that actually mirrors what did happen without the ideological sort of like intensity of the Truman administration, who did let Stalin, quote unquote, own Eastern Europe. Eisenhower did by 53, I think, once he decides not to aid the rebels. So I think he would have had the exact same thing. It's just with way less US Soviet tension. But that's kind of an orthogonal argument. But how is the war crucial, and what does FDR think he is doing?
Well, just to start with that last point that you made and then work backwards, I think you're absolutely right. I think if FDR lives, you have a lot of geopolitical rivalry, you have some tensions, you have some cooperation, you have basically how international politics almost always functions. But you don't have this kind of declaration. Here's where, again, you mentioned Stephenson. I'm going to mention Stephenson here, where I think he's right. And Frederick Logevall and Campbell Craig make this argument in their book that America basically kind of declares Cold War. It's had enough of this kind of really frustrating, irritating jockeying for power and feeling each other out in 1946, 47. And then they kind of impose this existential zero sum game, winner take all struggle for the world. But the Soviet Union wasn't struggling for the soul of the world. They were struggling, at least in the late 40s, to control Eastern Europe because that's been the corridor for invading the Soviet Union. But the United States had this global mentality. And I
And
think
Andrew,
because of,
I would link this very quickly to your earlier work. I think there's a Protestant millenarianism here. And I
for
think
sure,
it is a uniquely Protestant thing that happens in the 1940s, that they read onto the Soviet Union and they're read onto China in the last 10 years. Sorry to interrupt.
no, 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 that's a great intervention. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a Protestant mentality that goes back to the Reformation that if, and this is, I'd make this gesture in the book in Total Defense, a Reformation idea that if Protestantism is under threat somewhere, it's under threat everywhere. And this is the mentality that becomes sort of doctrine uh, through World War II, but especially in the Cold War, and the Truman administration adopts it wholesale.
So let's
This
talk about the
podcast
war.
remains a pro-Catholic
Oh yeah, we are definitely
podcast.
pro-Catholic here. I always call it a Jewish interest podcast. Um, but so what happens during the war, and what does FDR think he's doing during the war? And then let's talk a little bit about the Cold War. But the World War II is so crucial to
It
the
is.
basically institutionalization of it as a political moment here.
Yeah, really interestingly. So FDR he turns to national security, the language of national security after 1937, and he uses it constantly uh, up until Pearl Harbor, and after Pearl Harbor, it drops off. He barely uses that phrase again because the U.S. is at war. This kind of, for me, sealed the deal that it had as much to do with domestic politics, as more to do with domestic politics than the actual world situation. And during the war, he fights the war. He sets up this huge warfare state in order to win the war. As we've said before, I think we both agree that he intended it to be temporary and not to be everlasting. He thought that the peace would, after the war, would only be sustainable if the U.S. and the USSR could get along. Maybe not be allies, but could get along. Although, sometimes he did think there might be convergence of interests between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so that's what he's thinking. He's just thinking of winning the war. He's not thinking of setting up this. I mean, there are people, as Stephen Wertheim quite persuasively demonstrates, there are people in his administration who are thinking permanent military dominance, but not necessarily to kind of, intervene in wars all over the world. It's to have this, it's to stop that accordion state. And I wish I'd thought of it like that. And in relation to Stephen's book when I was writing the book, because I'd make it more explicit. But that kind of Calhoun's idea of an expansible army now is a permanent army. But that doesn't come till the Cold War. That's not really a World War II thing for FDR and a lot of people around
Is the American public convinced during and after the war? And then we'll conclude with what happens during the Cold War.
Yeah, they're convinced during the war because the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor and they want to win the war. But what I found really interesting is that all through the war, just like Steve Casey wrote a terrific book about this during the Korean War, and he wrote a terrific book about this for World War II as well, where actually even after Pearl Harbor, a lot of Americans aren't convinced that this is really a fight for them. Yes, they want to defeat Japan, no question about it. They want to have revenge for Pearl Harbor and that kind of thing. But to sort of wage this global war for democracy, to sort of, implement the Atlantic Charter and fulfill the four freedoms and so on and so forth, a lot of Americans aren't really on board with that. And they're carried along with it because it's part of the war effort, and that's what they're going to do. And really, the goal is to win the war. It's not necessarily to have this global project. And what I found really interesting is that even before the end of the War Department is already planning for demobilization. So that expansible army, that accordion fiscal military state, was going to kick into action again. There was going to be this, and there was this drastic demobilization after World War II. The War Department starts planning for it as early as 43, which is a remarkable thing when you think about it. They're planning on demobilization after winning the war 2 years before the war is over. And there is this overwhelming popular desire to bring the troops back home, reduce the size of the military. So the public isn't on board. And I make the argument in total defense that the whole project of national security is an elite project. I know that some people argue that it's bottom up and there's a lot of popular culture around this, but I think that's later on in the Cold War. I think that's created by elite efforts. And I don't just mean government officials. In the book, I pay a lot of attention to Hollywood filmmakers, especially Frank Capra, who was kind of an instrument used by FDR and Stimson and George Marshall and later Harry Truman in order to get support for this national security idea. So I don't think that people are on board. I think they have to be brought on board. When they are brought on board because they think that their lives are, on a daily basis, their lives are at risk, then it's kind of hard to switch that off. But I don't think that comes until the 1950s.
So, Andrew, moving past World War II into the Cold War, can you talk a little bit about how this notion of national security, as nebulous as it is, uh, comes to be institutionalized to define basically U.S. interests as global, and global domination is the only way to really protect the American people?
Yeah, it's kind of the culmination of what we've been talking about in terms of what builds through the war and into the early Cold War. And when you have this process of demobilization in 45 and into 46 by huge popular and congressional demand as well, because Congress is responding, I think, to a lot of pressure they're feeling from their voters. Um, Truman and Marshall, especially, are really, really freaked out. They're really worried, and they think this is a catastrophic mistake. that the American public and Congress are making by asking, for their husbands and brothers and uncles and to come home and to demobilize the military because most Americans don't want that. And so they start trying to make a public relations case, kind of like what FDR did in the late 30s for this permanent, well, for what we would later call the national security state, for some kind of permanent readiness. And then the Soviets come along as a kind of handy villain that can be used as a foil in order to or make the case for a much larger and permanent military posture. And they do that through a sense of threat. And they do that by taking that language of national security that FDR used from 37 to 41. It didn't disappear after 41, but it kind of falls away. And then it just is turbocharged in 1946, 47, 48. And it's very, very effective. And, talk about the national interest sort of dies away. And other ways of expressing American foreign policy or foreign interests or global interests or whatever you want to call it, they become very much second place to national security, because when you convince people that their basic security is at risk and if they don't act otherwise that they're going to be in danger, then people are willing to go along with an awful lot of stuff. This kind of gets back to what Danny and I were talking about with the illiberalism of liberalism. And I argue in the book that FDR and then later Truman practiced a kind of liberalism of fear, that the whole notion of the liberal project and that social contract is based on a sense of fear, and only we can protect you from these dangers.
So one thing I want to underline and maybe just ask you to comment on it a bit more explicitly is that I agree. I don't think anti-communism wasn't there, and I don't think that Stalin made moves that for people who lived through the trauma of the 30s and 40s one could reasonably have read as aggressive. But I
Yeah,
think you and I agree that is not the major thing that is necessarily happening here, even though it is important. And then the real question is no Soviet Union, no American empire. That's a real one because it's difficult to imagine that. But I'm curious if I get your talk a bit more explicitly about the role of anti-communism here.
yeah, and you're right. I certainly don't want. Sometimes when I make this argument, people think that because I'm making it seem, as as we talked about earlier, that FDR is being dishonest, that therefore it's somehow meaning that Nazi Germany wasn't a threat, or it's somehow letting off the Germans. And I don't want to do that. And nor do I want to sort of portray that Stalin is peace loving and he's completely, you know, all he wants is peace and harmony and prosperity. And there's a lot of blood on Stalin's hands. We know that. And there's a lot of blood on his hands after 1945. So it doesn't necessarily, making this argument about Truman does not make Stalin necessarily a good actor. But what I am convinced of is that Stalin did not have ambitions of global domination or global hegemony, that his security interests were initially Eastern Europe. And by controlling Eastern Europe, that would protect the Soviet Union. But the Truman administration has these global interests. Now, in terms of anti-communism, once you have that narrative that um, the communists and Soviets are bent on conquest and they're expansionist, and the only thing that's going to stop them is force, which is essentially the argument about containment. We have to meet them with counterforce at every moment where they're going to expand. And because communism fits so perfectly into this idea, this doctrine of national security, that self-defense means protecting not just against physical threats, but protecting a way of life. And where communism is really good at spreading its ideas and at planting agents, and maybe those agents were real because there were in the early Cold War, or rather there were in World War II, not so much in the early Cold War. There were actual communist agents, nowhere near as many as people said there were, but there's enough truth there to make people actually fear. And then communism and whatever we want to call it, Americanism, American capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism, they're antitheses on almost everything. When you think about religion, individual rights, the economy, um, the polity, like how to organize a government, they're exact 180 opposites on every single thing. So you add all those together, and then you have as you were saying, Danny, a plausible sense of threat from an actor like Stalin, and you read his actions not through what what the Soviet Union wants in that moment, but you read his actions through the lessons of the late 1930s and appeasement and that sort of thing, then it's a perfect matrix for taking this FDR's idea of national security and, as I said, turbocharging it and applying it to the Soviet Union.
And then institutionalizing it in the
And
national
institutional,
security
that's the
state.
moment.
Yeah.
Exactly. You institutionalize it, that's the moment. Boom, you've got it. Once it's turned on, towards the end of the book, I compare it, to the theory of the ever expanding universe that once it's turned on, my God, it's really, really hard to turn off.
So, Andrew, that's where your book ends, but I want to talk a little bit about um, the post 47, late 40s, early 50s history before we go. So, I don't know if you saw, but David Bell wrote a very critical semi review of the Cold War liberalism book,
I
which,
actually haven't seen it.
yeah,
Sorry.
on his Substack. But anyway, the main criticism was that I was attributing too much causal weight to the Cold War liberals, or I would call the New Deal cum Cold War liberals. I'm of the mind that the American empire really is in its foundations a liberal empire, and is distinguished in various ways. You know, the introduction from previous British and French liberal empires, but is genuinely a liberal empire. And I'm just curious of your thoughts about. Do you agree with that supposition? It's kind of it's kind of where your book leads from my reading, but I'm obviously biased in that. And what role does liberalism in this late 40s moment have to play in what the American empire becomes? And how do you read the history of the American empire in Korea, Vietnam, Central America, Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I see my book as a kind of um, prehistory or prequel to Cold War liberalism, like to your work. And I think there is a continuum there. There's some change, but there's also a lot of continuity. One of the puzzles that motivated me um, right from the very beginning of doing this book is trying to tease out the relationship between political economy and domestic politics and then foreign policy. And one of the sort of puzzles that I could never quite solve until I wrote this book, and maybe I haven't solved it, but I think I've certainly provided an answer, is why were the um, war presidents of the 20th century also all uh, liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats who tried to put in place a big domestic reform program? Say Wilson in World War One, FDR in World War Two, Truman in Korea, Johnson in Vietnam, and then a lot of their adversaries through that period are people like Herbert Hoover or Dwight Eisenhower, who are not sympathetic to the New Deal and to the big domestic state, and they're not sympathetic to foreign intervention. And that was a really uncomfortable question because it called into question a lot of my own political, much of my own political outlook. Um, and so I think there is a link there. I think there is a really strong link that we've talked about throughout this podcast on both sides of that dyad within liberalism in terms of domestic security and foreign security or military security. Um, and I think that relationship is it inherent to liberalism? I think you could make a very strong argument to that. I think I probably would. Um, what for me the puzzle that I wasn't really able to completely solve in the book, but the book really doesn't cover that period. The book mostly finishes in 1947, and I have an epilogue after 1947. Is what happens after the 60s, because Vietnam really cracks that relationship between. It doesn't break it because Clinton comes back and really revives that relationship between war and liberalism. You could say that Obama did as well too. And Obama wages one of the most disastrous wars in American history in the intervention in Libya in 2011 that has caused all sorts of problems. Although I don't see that as an ideological liberals war, but like Vietnam, for instance. Um, I think that might be volume two to Total Defense is figuring out what happens after Vietnam, after civil rights, after the Reagan Revolution and neoliberalism, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, to my mind, it's what happens is a shift. You could get the guns without the butter, as I put it in the Cold War liberalism thing. That
Absolutely.
it basically gets rid of the sort of social democratic skin that the military national security state has. And but there's way more work to be done on that. And maybe just as a final question, obviously, I mean, to my mind, I'm writing a piece on this now. We're the unipolar moment is over. We're entering a genuine multipolarity at the end of the American century, I think American hegemony will be dominant in the Western Hemisphere and the Middle East, and elsewhere it will be kind of returning to the system, I argue at least, that Roosevelt envisioned with his four policeman model of international relations. If people know, at Tehran, Roosevelt proposed to Stalin two bodies, the United Nations, which he was like, yeah, they'll talk about things, and then we'll have the real body, the four policemen, and they'll be the ones genuinely governing international relations. And I think we're returning to that world. So in a world where the United States is relatively and absolutely weaker than it has been since 1945, where do you see national security going? Is this a moment of transition, or is this sort of a discourse that's going to just continue unabated? What are your thoughts on that? And then we'll end.
I thought it was a moment. I thought we were living in a moment of transition. And I thought so because of a lot of what Donald Trump had done in his first administration, but especially a lot of what people around him, like it was clear that his second presidency was going to be much more MAGA focused, and there were going to be people around him. And people like JD Vance were calling into question the very fundamental tenets of national security. And Trump was saying the same kind of thing. Why are we getting involved in? And he would use Syria and then say, it's 6,000 miles away, or why do we have to get involved in Ukraine? It's 7,000 miles away. And JD Vance, time and time and time again, returned to this theme. He talked about, what place matters to me? Ohio matters to me. Kentucky matters to me. Those places matter. Ron DeSantis said the same thing. He has this line that I quote in the book where he says something like, I'm not sure George W. Bush actually did say this, but he says he listened to a speech and George W. Bush said, the survival of American freedom depends on the survival of Djibouti. And Ron DeSantis said to himself, what do I care about Djibouti? Like, really, is that the connection? So we could go on and mention all sorts of people who are pushing against this very expansive notion of national security that got America involved in the forever wars. And then, the real world intervenes, and you have, for better or worse, Donald Trump using national security to justify pretty much anything, including tariffs against allies. Like, he's not the first president to do that, by the way. George W. Bush slapped tariffs on Canadian steel in the name of using national security, because that's what the law says. The president can do this if he can find a national security reason for it. So Trump has been doing that. And then now we have a kind of quintessential national security war. So I think maybe I thought that we were in a moment of transition. I think it might be just too powerful, just too inexorable to really undo without something really cataclysmic happening. And as much as I would love to see a complete reform of the idea of national security, I'm not sure I want to live through the cataclysm that I think it would take to make that happen.
My guess is it's going to be operative in the reduced American sphere of influence. And when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, Maduro; when it comes to the North Atlantic world, Europe; when it comes to the Middle East, Iran, even though Iran is technically Southeast Asia, in the imagination, it's the Middle East, Southwest Asia, not Southeast Asia. Sorry, everyone. I think it's going to be operative there. And I think you're going to see different discourses in East Asia in particular, South Asia, and other areas of the world, Eastern Europe as well. That's my prediction. We will see. Andrew Preston, thank you so much. Everyone, check out Total Defense. It is an excellent, excellent book. And as always, I can't wait to see what you write next.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Derek.